All right, so welcome back to Unit 4, Transoceanic Interconnections. This is topic 4.3, the Columbian Exchange. So the thematic learning objective here deals with the transfer of disease, food, and people between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. The theme is humans and the environment, or environment if we're using the Spice Tea themes. The learning objective I'd like you to accomplish by the end of this lesson is be able to explain the causes of the Columbian exchange and its effect on the Eastern and Western hemispheres. Historically, the new connections between the Eastern and Western hemispheres resulted in the exchange of new plants, animals, and diseases, known as the Columbia Exchange. American foods became staple crops in various parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Cash crops were grown primarily on plantations with coerced labor and were exported mostly to Europe and the Middle East. European colonization of the Americas led to the unintentional transfer of disease vectors, including mosquitoes and rats, and the spread of diseases that were endemic in the Eastern Hemisphere, including smallpox, measles, and malaria. Some of these diseases substantially reduced the indigenous population with catastrophic effects in many areas. Afro-Eurasian fruit trees, grains, sugar, and domesticated animals were brought by Europeans to the Americas, while other foods were brought by African enslaved persons. Populations in Afro-Eurasia benefited nutritionally from the increased diversity of American food crops. So what is the Columbian Exchange? Well, the Columbian Exchange refers to the exchange of diseases, of ideas, food, and people between the Eastern and Western Hemisphere following Columbus's voyage to the New World. That takes us to the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. Before we jump into the Columbia Exchange itself, we need to backtrack a little to understand how European powers were divided up in the New World. The Treaty of Tordesillas would have long-lasting effects on events in the Americas, so it's important to cover that before we look at specific exchanges that took place during the 1450 to 1750 time period. When Columbus returned to Europe after his voyage, he stopped in Lisbon, Portugal, and met with King John II. When King John found out that Columbus had been sailing for Spain and claiming lands for Spain, this began a dispute between Portugal and Spain over ownership of newly discovered lands. The dispute was resolved by the Treaty of Tordesillas, which drew an imaginary line from pole to pole that divided Spanish and Portuguese territory. Land west of the line went to Spain, and land east of the line went to Portugal. You can see how Brazil came to be a Portuguese-speaking nation while the rest of South America is dominated by the Spanish language. That takes us to the colonization of the Americas between 1450 and 1750. Here we have some specific examples of colonized areas in the Americas, but this is not an exhaustive list. The colonized land extended far beyond the specific colonies highlighted here. The top left shows a depiction of early Spanish cruelty, known as the Black Legend, and indigenous barbarity, including human cannibalism in an attempt to justify their enslavement in the Caribbean islands. On the bottom left, we see a painting of a meeting between Cortez and Moctezuma of the Aztec Empire. Cortez, as we learned last topic, would go on to conquer and topple the Aztec Empire. The top right shows the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which would later become New York City. The right middle picture is of a tobacco plantation in Virginia where slaves are processing the crop. The bottom right shows the first meeting of the Portuguese and the natives of Brazil. While Portugal initially sought to establish trading posts in the Americas, they did eventually colonize Brazil and rule the territory as opposed to just setting up trading posts as they had done elsewhere in the world. So let's discuss some possible diseases from Hispaniola. There is documentation of one dangerous disease moving from the New World to Europe, syphilis. It is thought that Columbus and his crew may have picked up the bacteria that causes syphilis from the Tainos in Hispaniola during the first visit, his first voyage to the New World. Pictured here is a 15th century drawing of someone being treated for syphilis. It is important to stress that this is the only disease that is thought to have come from the Americas and then transferred to Europe. There has been debate about whether or not syphilis existed in Europe prior to Columbus's voyage, but the most recently found evidence supports the claim that it did in fact come to Europe from Hispaniola via the crew of Columbus's first voyage. So let's talk about the diseases from the Old World. Smallpox, measles, influenza, chickenpox, bubonic plague, typhus, scarlet fever, pneumonia, and malaria are the major known diseases that spread throughout the Americas during the Columbus exchange. As you can see, the transfer of diseases between the Americas and the Old World, which is Europe, Africa, and Asia, was a bit lopsided. Native populations in the Americas did not have any immunity to these new diseases, so the effect it had on their population was immense. Pictured below is an Aztec drawing of sufferers of smallpox. So what are the effects of disease during the Columbia Exchange? While precise numbers are impossible to calculate, it is estimated that upwards of 80 to 90% of some native populations throughout North and South America were killed within about a century of the arrival of Europeans. Total population loss due to disease is estimated at around 50%. The deadliest disease of the bunch was by far smallpox, and this event is considered the worst population disaster in history. Note that the map shows areas of known epidemics in 1600, but does not necessarily show every area that was affected to some degree by the diseases mentioned on the previous slide. Okay, so here we have an Aztec account of smallpox. This is a 1520 translated excerpt from an Aztec account of smallpox and how it affected people. What I'd like you to do is in your guided notes, I'd like you to read this excerpt and I want you to highlight and annotate it. When you're done, I want you to answer the two questions in your guided notes. One, how is the sickness described? And two, what is repeated or emphasized towards the end of this passage? So let's talk about the movement of food to Afro-Eurasia. Many of the foods which originated in the Americas have become worldwide staples since the Columbia Exchange. The potato, for example, is consumed and grown all over the world, and no South American country is even in the top 10 for potato production as of 2022, even though the potato used to exist only in South America. Tomatoes are heavily associated with Italian food, but before the Columbian Exchange, they came from Peru. We also see the movement of crops and animals to the Americas. While food and crops moved from the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia, the same was happening in the other direction. Horses were first domesticated in Central Asia about 6,000 years ago, and from there they were brought into Europe. Spanish conquistadors brought horses to the Americas, and horses eventually became an important part of North American native cultures. Livestock for meat was another important introduction to the Americas. Argentina is now famously known for its beef, but prior to the Columbian Exchange, there were no cows there. Sugarcane is an important crop to focus on because it became a cash crop and plantations were established to grow the crop with the use of slave labor. But more on the importation of people in the Columbia Exchange later. So what are the effects of the food exchange? Well, the population of Europe doubled between 1500 and 1750 from approximately 65 million to 127 million. Most of this growth occurred between 1500 to 1600. So in your guided notes, I want you to read the following two questions, and I want you to write your answers on your guided note. Number one, what do you think was the number one cause of this population boom in Europe? And number two, how is this similar or different to the population growth that Song China had experienced? So let's talk about the movement of people to the Americas. The transfer of people within the Columbia Exchange was largely one way. European settlers came to both North and South America to live in various colonies. Slave labor from Africa into the Americas brought a major influx of people and culture. About 12 million enslaved Africans were brought to the New World between 1540 and 1860, with about half of those enslaved people going to Brazil. When it comes to cash crops and slave labor, cash crops are crops produced for the commercial value rather than use by the farmer. Portugal had discovered how valuable the cultivation of sugar as a cash crop could be well before the Columbian Exchange began. I want you to recall from the last topic that Portugal colonized the uninhabited island of Madeira and turned it into a highly profitable sugar-producing colony in the early 1400s. Harvesting sugarcane is labor-intensive, so Portugal had to also have a supply of laborers to cut, grow, and process sugarcane. African slaves were brought to Madeira to work the sugarcane farms. By the end of the 15th century, Madeira was the world's leading producer of sugar. It was this model of sugarcane production in Madeira that would be applied to both Brazil and the West Indies in the Caribbean after the Portuguese and the Spanish began setting up colonies in the Americas. Sugarcane was brought to Brazil and the West Indies from Europe, and African slaves were brought in to work on the highly lucrative sugar farms. Madeira lost its status as the leader of sugar production when Brazil became the center of sugar production during the era of the Columbian Exchange. Pictured on the left are enslaved workers harvesting sugarcane in Madeira, and the picture below is of a sugarcane crop. Okay, so let's examine this chart on Brazilian sugar exports. You guys have this chart in your guided reading packets as well, so go ahead and take a look at the chart in your guided reading packets. Highlight if you need to, make notes on it if you need to. Once you've done that, I want you to answer these three questions. Number one, the first sugar mill was set up in Brazil around 1535. Using the chart to help you answer this question, about how long did it take for sugar production for export to reach over 20,000 metric tons? Using, once again, the chart to help you, answer question number two. What do you notice about the general trend in the price of exported sugar? Now, remember, these prices are from London and Lisbon. And then lastly, using the chart to answer number three, what might this price trend suggest about overall sugar production or consumption worldwide? All right, so let's focus on the triangular trade. Brazil's sugar mills are a good example of a specific industry that fueled what is known as the triangular trade. In addition to general transfers of goods, disease, and people between the Old World and the New World, a particular pattern of trade emerged in which enslaved Africans came to the Americas. Raw materials and cash crops, such as sugar, went from the Americas to Europe, and Europe exported finished goods to Africa. The need for the continued importation of slave labor from Africa was because of expanding industries that were labor intensive. for example, sugar mills. And the type of labor done by enslaved people was so dangerous and strenuous that it was common for them to die within a decade of beginning work in the Americas. These enslaved African workers functioned as disposable labor in many cases. I want to emphasize to you that triangular trade refers to more than just Brazil and sugar. This is simply an example of specific goods within the triangular trade. So let's focus in on the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade is also called the Middle Passage, and it is one leg of the aforementioned triangular trade. The vast majority of slaves sold via the transatlantic slave trade were from Central and West Africa. Many were sold to European traders by West Africans, and others were taken directly from slave raids. The Portuguese are the only Europeans that frequently engaged directly in slave raids in Africa. Portugal had a strong foothold in Africa from the earlier maritime efforts. This trade was active from the 1520s all the way until the 1860s, and over 12 million enslaved Africans arrived in the Americas by way of the Middle Passage during that time. Brazil was one of the biggest receivers of Africans during the Columbian exchange era. So what are the lasting effects of the slave trade? The slave trade permanently changed the social landscape of the Americas. The importation of enslaved Africans created an African diaspora in many places. Brazil's population today is incredibly diverse, and over half of the country's residents claim African heritage. African diaspora created new languages, music styles, and introduced new foods to both North and South America. Okay, so I would like you to take a couple minutes to pause the slide and take a really good look at the image on the slide. I want you to focus in on answering this question on your discussion, on your reading guide. What Columbian exchange elements are present in this map? So take a very close look. What elements do you see? Okay, and with that, we have wrapped up our review of topic 4.3. Here are the main ideas that you should mark down in a separate notebook so you can have them in one quick place for your test. 1, the Columbia Exchange. It refers to the transfer of goods, ideas, disease, and people between Western and Eastern hemispheres. Spain and Portugal dominated early exchanges. Disease spread from Europeans to natives of the Americas who had no immunity. At least half of natives in the New World died as a result. Food and livestock changed diets in both hemispheres and led to a population boom in Europe. Enslaved people were brought to the Americas via the Middle Passage, and the slave trade resulted in the transfer of African culture to the Americas. As always, make sure you watch Heimler's topic review video for topic 4.3. The link to that is in the description. I also want you to complete the Columbian Exchange graphic organizer for 4.3. From there, it's going to talk about different things that were exchanged on the Columbia Exchange. I want you to explain the effect that the listed items had on the area it was introduced to during the Columbian Exchange. This includes smallpox, horses, potatoes, okra, alpacas, firearms, sugar, and rubber. I want you to tell me where they came from, where they were introduced to, and what their effect was. That's all I have for you today. I'll see you back here for topic 4.4.